Good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to call this meeting of PST, Public Safety, Transportation, and Environment Subcommittee to order. Just want to recognize my colleagues first. I want to recognize Senator George Edwards, our veteran of this subcommittee. I want to recognize Senator Johnny Ray Sailing, and unfortunately, we're not joined at this moment, but also wanted to recognize Senator Jackson, all a part of PSTE. Today, we will be hearing the overview for Mdot. We'll also be hearing from the Office of Administrative Hearings. I'm going to call Steve McCullough, our phenomenal policy analyst, to give us the Mdot overview.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name is Steve McCullough with the Department of Legislative Services, here to present the Mdot overview. Jumping right in, the first exhibit just shows the COVID impacts on transportation services. This should be a familiar chart for many people. We can see that back in April of 2020, the pandemic began, really all the services fell sharply. Since that time, over the extended time, generally things have trended back towards the level of pre-pandemic, but as you can see, MTA services, BWI traffic, passenger traffic are still well below pre-COVID levels. Traffic in terms of both car traffic weekly and truck traffic has approached closer to pre-pandemic levels, and in fact, the statewide truck volume has now exceeded 2019 levels, which this is comparing to. Looking at the forecasts, the 6-year forecasts for the Transportation Trust Fund, the first and third number columns are the forecasts from last year and the current year, and they both compared against the 2020 forecast, which is the last pre-pandemic forecast. And this just really shows that last year, we were really looking at the severe impacts of the pandemic, a $1.6 billion write-down in revenues. With the current forecast, we're compared to the 2020 forecast, up by $505 million in revenues. But as you can see in the various pluses and minuses in this final column, the improvement has not been uniform. We're still lower than pre-pandemic levels for the motor fuel tax, titling tax, and corporate income tax are both above that level. But some of the other revenues are below as well. That goes as well for operating revenues, and this is largely due to, as we saw in the previous chart, the MTA services are, still well below in terms of passenger ridership. So those revenues, are not returning to the pre-pandemic levels. I would also note that, this line here, the federal COVID stimulus relief funding, there's $888 million more in this forecast than in the pre-pandemic. Obviously, there was no funding from that source. But without that $888 million in this forecast, we would actually still be lower in revenue, total revenue, than the pre-pandemic. Exhibit 3 is the closeout for fiscal 2021. There was the closeout closed out $425 million greater than the or with a level of 425, which is $275 million more than the estimate. Again, that was largely due to federal COVID stimulus provided in the fiscal 2021 budget. Looking,
I gave you the stuff that people had Justin read that one.
Exhibit 4 shows the state source revenues for the trust fund. The three largest. The three largest revenue sources for the trust fund are the motor fuel tax, titling tax, and federal capital. If we look at the state source revenues, then the registration fees comes in at number 3. Exhibit 5 shows the full 6-year forecast by year. And I just have a few things highlighted. The closing balance shows the 21 actual balance that we just talked about came in higher, and you see that flows through over the next few years with higher than normal closing balances, and that's largely due to Mdot's plan to spread out the federal stimulus and relief funding over multiple years. The last year currently programmed is in 2024. And so you see those balances being carried forward into those future years. But even after that, Mdot is increasing its targeted closing balance to 200 million. They've over the years have increased it periodically to account for working capital needs for both the operating and the capital budget. Other things of note for the forecast in the current year under consideration, fiscal 2023, Mdot does not expect to issue any bonds to support the capital program. Regarding the issuance of bonds, look at debt outstanding. In all years, it's below the statutory maximum level, and the debt service coverage ratios are above the minimum 2.5 that Mdot has adopted as an administrative practice. However, as you can see, by 2027, they are approaching that minimum level. Exhibit 6 shows the 6-year capital fund program by source, and you can see here that the capital program does depend on general funds. This is the dedicated grant for WMATA that remains in the forecast throughout the period. You also notice that special funds throughout the forecast are going down. There are a couple reasons for that. One of the biggest ones is the withdrawal of the federal stimulus spending. Since the federal funding is being used on the operating side, that has freed up special funds to be spent on the capital. And as those funds go away, more of that special fund needs to backfill and be used on the operating side, which leaves less for capital. Exhibit 7 just shows the 6-year transportation capital program by mode. We'll talk about this a little more detail later, but this just shows that compared to the 2021 plan, the 2022 plan increases by $2.5 billion. And that just reflects the improving picture that we've just been talking about. Exhibit 8 shows the history of the capital program spending and the estimates for 2022 through 2027. You'll notice the ramp up in capital spending that occurred after 2013, which is the last time the motor fuel tax was increased. That increase was used to leverage additional debt, which supported the capital program. And it culminates in this current fiscal year with a capital program of over $3 billion, the first time that's occurred in Maryland history. But you'll see that in the remaining part of the forecast, capital spending will actually decrease for a few years before slightly increasing by the end of the period. Exhibit 19 now turns away from the 6-year comparison and starts looking at fiscal 2023. And this chart shows the uses of the Transportation Trust Fund revenues by use. And so you can see that the state capital program accounts for over 45% of spending, with operating making up the next biggest at 41%. Exhibit 10 shows the detail by mode for the operating, the capital, debt service, and state aid. These are the numbers you will actually find in the budget bill and in the budget books. And you can see that the operating portion of Mdot's budget increases by $60.2 million or 2.7% over the current year working appropriation. On the capital side, there's a decrease of $400.4 million or 13.5%, largely driven, or more than largely driven, by the decrease in the Maryland Transit Administration relating to cash flows for the purple line. That's a decrease of 13.5%, and then overall spending for all categories decreases in the current year by $300.9 million. Exhibit 11 shows the operating budget. So we're just talking about that top portion from the last graph by mode. And as is always the case, transit has the share of the operating program, because transit is a very personnel intensive operation. And you can see that the combined transit MTA and WMATA shares is more than half the operating spending. Looking at positions, there are no increases in either regular positions or contractual positions in the allowance compared to the working appropriation. There are some interdepartmental transfers between units, and those will be discussed in the individual modal budget hearings. Looking at local transportation aid or highway user revenues, the allowance includes $276 million for local aid. That's an increase of $10.2 million, and that is just a reflection of the increase in revenues as those grants are calculated as a percentage of revenues credited to the gasoline motor vehicle revenue account. One note for highway user revenues, the administration has introduced bills, House Bills 410 and Senate Bill 400, to extend the current enhanced rate going to locals of 13.5% and make that a permanent level of allocation for the local aid. Looking at the capital budget fiscal 2023 by mode, you see that state highway accounts for a third of the capital program, with transit and WMATA accounting for another 39%, excuse me, of the capital program. The capital program, in addition to the state funds, is funded from various sources that do not flow generally through the state budget. I do have highlighted a couple exceptions to that. The Howard Street Tunnel program or project is receiving $51.5 million in GO bond funding in the current year. Excuse me for the scrolling. And the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, WMATA, there's the $167 million in general funds that I mentioned a few exhibits ago. In total, other funds in fiscal 2023 provide about $590 million in support of the capital spending. Just a note, in the sources of other spending, there are a large portion of it comes through the airport, through passenger facility charges and customer facility charges. And then throughout the other modes, there are local contributions when locals are participating in a project, and various private companies for other projects. Looking now, or turning now to the issues. The first issue is a discussion of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, that was passed by Congress and signed by the President back in November. It will provide $1.2 trillion for transportation and non-transportation infrastructure spending across the nation. That, however, is not all new spending or new funding, because the IIJA also reauthorizes the Surface Transportation Program, which was previously authorized under the Fixing America's Surface Transportation, or FAST Act. So new funding through the IIJA totals about $505 billion. Now, Maryland is expected to receive $8.2 billion over 5 years for infrastructure spending. Of that, 2.8 represents new funding or enhanced funding of existing programs, which is about a 35% increase over current levels. For transportation, $6.9 billion of funding is expected over 5 years. But again, a big chunk of that is existing funding that continues from the FAST Act at enhanced levels. Looking now at the highways and bridge portion of infrastructure spending, the IIJA provides $351 billion for roads and bridges, which is $110 billion more than under the FAST Act. Exhibit 17, shown here on the screen, there are basically two major pots of funding for highways and bridges. The Highway Trust Fund provides the largest chunk of funding, and this chart shows that funding through the Highway Trust Fund largely states on a formula basis, 90%, with the other 10% being discretionary or competitive grants. This funding through the IIJA is at about almost a 30% increase over the FAST Act levels. The other money for highways and bridges is the general fund. For many years now, Congress has supplemented Highway Trust Fund with general fund appropriations. And you can see here $47.3 billion has been authorized through the IIJA. 72%, so 3/4 still goes out in the form of formula funding, but through this portion of funding, a greater proportion will be used for competitive grant programs. Exhibit 19 shows the Highway Trust Fund formula programs and the levels that they are expected to be funded. This is on a national basis, including a new carbon reduction program that's funded at $6.4 billion over the 5 years. In addition to the formula funding, there are a handful, more than a handful of new programs. It's a 2-page exhibit. I'm not going to go through all of them. It's there for people to peruse at their leisure. But I do want to point out that of these new programs, the vast majority are discretionary or competitive. And you can tell that with the D in the type columns. F is formula, and if it's got a mix of formula and competitive, then you'll see the F/D. Turning now to transit infrastructure spending, the IIJA provides nationally $108 billion over the 5 years, which is a $39 billion increase over the FAST Act levels. Similar to highway and bridge funding, there are several pots that are paying for transit. The largest is the Highway Trust Fund, almost $70 billion, but there are also general funds through advanced appropriations, and also $17 billion of this 108 are authorized appropriations, but still subject to congressional action. So if Congress fails to appropriate the full 17 billion, then this 108 billion number will actually decrease. Exhibit 21 compares the formula program through the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA, and compares the IIJA levels, which are the top orangish bars, with the levels under the FAST Act. The formula funding under IIJA is an increase of nearly 35% over the FAST Act levels. Competitive grants will also be available for the transit programs, and over the 5-year period will total $36.8 billion. Turning now to the second issue, this is a discussion of the Purple Line and the replacement design build contractor that was recently selected. Just as background, very quickly, as you know, the Purple Line Transit Partners, PLTP, was selected by MTA in 2016 to design, build, finance, operate, and maintain the Purple Line for a 36-year P3 contract. However, shortly after that contract was awarded, a lawsuit halted the project as the federal courts vacated the record of decision. That record of decision was reinstated, but there was a delay of between a year and a year and a half, which resulted in claims by the contractor under the P3 contract for additional time and money related to these delays. The parties negotiated but could not come to an agreement, which led the contractor, the original design build contractor, to exit the project. MTA and PLTP continued to negotiate and did come up and sign a settlement agreement that resolved all the issues leading up to that point. The settlement agreement required MTA to make a settlement payment of $250 million over 2 installments, and also required PLTP to do a procurement to get a replacement design build contractor for the project. So that has occurred, and with the new design build contractor contract negotiated, there is now certainty on the project cost and the project schedule. And Exhibit 23 gives an overview of the change in the project costs. The first column is the original agreement cost. That was $5.6 billion. That was not just for the construction, but that was also for the 30-year operations and maintenance costs for the project. The revised agreement comes in at $9.3 billion. So there's a $3.4 billion increase. Factors that Mdot cites for the increase, large one being, of course, the delay called by the federal court action. The pandemic also occurred between the start of the construction and the current point. With that pandemic, there have been supply chain issues. There have also been wage increases, mandatory wage increases through laws in Maryland and in Montgomery County. And then again, related to the delay, there's the inflationary costs that are involved. Looking at just the construction part of the P3 contract, this chart shows the changes by category in the contract costs for construction. The first column is the original agreement. So construction was expected to cost just about $2 billion. The second column, labeled expended, this is the amount that's actually been expended to this point. And then the additional new represents the new spending, the new amount under the new contract that was just approved by the Board of Public Works at the end of last month, leading to the revised construction amount of $3.4 billion. The remaining milestones for the project, now that the design build contractor replacement is on board, expected mobilization will start up this spring after both financial and commercial close occur. And then the revenue service, there are various intervening steps, but the line is actually supposed to open for service in the fall of 2026. And that service will be end-to-end service. Previously, there had been a plan at one point to open the line in 2 phases. That is no longer a case. They are working to do a full opening at that point. Under the revised contract, it was just approved by the Board of Public Works, PLTP will be seeking to refinance the project. PLTP is going to be covering the costs of the remaining construction. MTA has put in all of the construction dollars up to this point that the state will put in until it begins repaying that construction costs through the availability payments. So PLTP is expected to negotiate a new TIFIA loan with the federal government up to $1.7 billion. Also to issue an additional $700 million in private activity bonds. The private activity bonds, $313 million that were issued to help fund construction to this point, have been fully repaid at this point. In addition to the refinancing, the P3 contract does have modified terms, and those are in 4 main areas shown here. The first is to risk allocation, and essentially the state is assuming risk for the work that's already been completed, so that if there's any kind of material defects in that work, the state would have to correct that. The modifications also include the removal of the unconditional right to terminate. And that was the clause under which the previous design build contractor exited the project. There is also a requirement due to change market conditions for an owner-controlled insurance program through the end of the construction period. And the from the agreement, was removed light rail vehicle options. While MTA was managing the project over the last year, it did exercise an option for additional light rail vehicles and purchase those. These options were expiring soon, and so as part of the amendments to the agreement, the decision was made to just remove those options to make things cleaner. And then finally, the terms of the agreement were modified to streamline the claims dispute and resolution procedures. So in conclusion, for the purple line, there have been a lot of discussion in the media over the years about this project, and it's easy in hindsight to maybe look at different things or decisions that could have been taken that would have avoided what has occurred on the purple line. However, I would note that MTA could easily have faced the same delays and cost increases using a more familiar procurement method, such as design build. So it's not necessarily a P3 flaw that caused the problems. However, it does point out the dangers of overselling the benefits of using a P3. Certainly at the beginning of the process, many people thought that a P3 transferred all risk from the state onto the private partner. And as this project has demonstrated, that is not the case. And so it really does point out, kind of as a lesson learned, that even with a P3 agreement, all the parties, both the state and the private partners, need to work and be flexible to keep their interests aligned to complete the project. And it's hoped that this lesson will be, carried forward into future projects. The next issue is a very brief update on the managed toll lanes project for the Capital Beltway. This has been rebranded as Op Lanes Maryland. As you are aware, last summer, the state did enter into a phase P3 development contract for pre-construction work. That is ongoing, and SHA and MDTA, which are the state reporting agencies for the project, do expect to have a P3 agreement for construction in hand by late spring and send that negotiated contract for the construction of Phase 1 South to the Board of Public Works by early fall, after legislative and public review that would occur during the session. During the summer. I would note finally on this that there is a protest by one of the losing bidders for the phase developer contract that worked its way through the administrative process with the Department of Transportation, and now a claim has been filed in the Circuit Court for Montgomery County. And then finally, the last issue for this analysis is a repeat of an analysis that I did a few years ago, looking at, since the motor fuel gas tax increase that was passed in fiscal 2023, just looking at how the additional revenues over the 2023 base budget have been spent. And Exhibit 26 shows the additional funding that has come in, which totals $8.5 billion between 2014 and 2021, and shows them by category. So of those additional funds, 52% spent on capital, 33% on operating, 12% on debt service, and local aid went up, or 3% was spent on local aid. Looking at just operating spending from this increased revenue, you can see that, similar to the current year's budget we talked about just a minute ago, transit, both MTA and WMATA, are the lion's share of the operating budget spending. Looking at the capital, you can see that kind of flips, and State Highway Administration has received 68% of the additional capital spending that's been realized since 2013, with MTA and WMATA coming in at 14%, and the rest of the department accounting for 18% of that additional capital spending. And then when you combine the capital and operating, you can still see that SHA was the single largest section that got the majority of the new spending, with the transit being the second, and the rest of the department sharing 19% of those additional revenues. And the final exhibit for this issue, because I did this analysis a few years ago, the top orange bars on this chart show the operating and capital share of spending. The orange bars was the 2014 to 2019 comparison, and the bottom bars are the comparison that brings it up to the current day that I just spoke about in those previous exhibits. And what this does show is that SHA has their share, has decreased in the last few years compared to that first analysis, while MTA and especially WMATA have gained on that comparison. Turning to the recommended action, there are two recommended actions that are annual recommendations. The first is to require notification to any changes in the capital program. The second is to establish a position cap for both regular and contractual positions. And Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Steve, for such a detailed overview of the Mdot committee. I do see one hand and one question at this time. Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you as well, Steve, for very detailed presentation. I look forward to delving a little more. Just a couple of questions real quick. So the P3 term modifications, obviously this impacts my region, the purple line, but so were those modifications made solely for this particular contract, or are they going forward in P3 for P3 projects going forward?
No, so nothing that's a purple line actually changes the underlying statute for P3. So if there's a desire to do, to have the process changed, that this is simply modifications to the contract that reflected, the reality of the settlement agreement, the new design build contractor, and the change in schedule that's required in order to accommodate all of that.
Thank you. And second, if I might, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
So in regard to the toll lane project, one of the counties I represent is on the fifth phase of that project. And if you made mention the award process amid a ongoing protest of that process, do you anticipate, or maybe this is for the agency itself, any further delays as we're moving forward? As it seems the P3 contract process seems to be working out pretty swiftly. So my concern is being part of phase 5. What do you anticipate, if anything? Thank you.
So, yeah, I think that probably is more for the department to answer on what they expect. I just, as pointed out, there was a protest because, as we saw, it can have an impact. However, there are probably lawsuits involved in most large projects, and it all depends on the merits and what the courts decide. But the department may have a better answer of what they anticipate.
Thank you, Senator Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Steve, I got, if you could go back to Exhibit 10. If that's the right one or not. Is that 10?
That is 10. What?
I see it.
What are you thinking about? I can.
Well, I'm trying to figure it out here. I just made a note. This will come into my final question. You can go to 15 right now, and then I'll ask other questions.
Sure.
Exhibit 15.
Yes, 15 is the other funds.
Yeah, down here it says upgrades to Howard Street Tunnel. Now it says Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, 5, is that billion or million?
Million.
Coming from Pennsylvania to help do the tunnel? Is that what that means?
No, so the whole Howard Street Tunnel project is not just the tunnel. It is the tunnel and all of the bridges between Howard Street Tunnel and basically Philadelphia to allow double stacking. They're bridges. And so that piece is actually in Pennsylvania. And so that's Pennsylvania's share. But because the federal grant for the project is for the entire project, they needed to show what all of the non-federal share is. And that piece, which is in Pennsylvania for their own bridge, we show it in the summary for the project.
So I guess you went through this pretty quick, but can you do a short little summary? Don't need to do it this minute. I'm sure if I piece all these together, I can get it, but you mentioned the FAST Act, you mentioned IIJA, the Highway Trust Fund. Can you put a little bullet chart together saying which each of these are and when do they run out? 'Cause one of them might have been Exhibit 10 and I just didn't see it there. It goes up for like 4 years and then it drops way down into like the 5th year, I think it was.
You're talking about the capital spending.
Or just totally, what do we get from the FAST Act? What do we get from the Highway Trust Fund? And what
Okay.
IIJA fund?
Okay, so just a couple things because we're kind of talking apples and oranges here. So the FAST Act was the surface transportation authorization that went up through 2020 and then has been continuing under a continuing resolution through 2021 and was just replaced by the IIJA. So the FAST Act is over. The IIJA is the new Surface Transportation Authorization Act. And it is the appropriations and authorizations in that act that authorizes the spending from the Highway Trust Fund. The Highway Trust Fund is like the Transportation Trust Fund. It's the source where things are collected, the revenues from the gas tax. It's not in itself, it doesn't do anything except provide, an accounting mechanism. It's the IIJA now.
Is this a 5-year program too, or just a year?
It is a 5-year program. It goes from federal fiscal 2022 through 2026.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Seeing no further questions from the members of the committee, I want to say thank you again, Mr. McCulloch, for your detailed analysis and overview of Mdot. At this time, I'd just like to bring up Secretary Ports. Secretary Ports, before you get started with your response, just wanted to say on behalf of the committee, just congratulations on your ascension to Secretary of Mdot, and we all look forward to continued partnership in your new role.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that, Mr. Chairman. And when I'll get started, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman McCray and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Jim Ports, Secretary of Maryland Department of Transportation. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here before you today to talk about the department's budget. Before I get started though, I just want to give a shout out to Steve. I know you said how valuable he was. I don't know if you know this, Mr. Chairman, but I tried to steal him a couple of years ago and he wouldn't come over, okay? And as you can see, he has a wealth of wisdom when he gets these questions. He is unbelievably good at his job. And if I ever get a chance to steal him, I'm still gonna try. I'm just gonna
100% agree, but I do think you got a couple folks over there from our team. Let's hold on to Steve.
We do, Mr. Chairman, but we recognize talent when we see it, and we'll go after it. Anyway, with that, although I've been presenting these types of budgets for many years at hearings in the past, this is my first time I've done so as secretary. As you know, I've been around the department for many, many years, and I want to thank Governor Hogan for giving me the opportunity to serve as secretary in this terrific department. Between Mdot and MDTA, there are over 10,000 employees who have been working hard to continue to provide these essential services and excellent customer service throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the last 2 years, these employees have demonstrated their dedication, flexibility, resiliency in responding to ever-changing circumstances that we found ourselves in. You know, Steve discussed some of the operational stats over the last 2 years regarding the usage of transportation system. At the lowest points of usage in April 2020, traffic volumes on our roadways were down nearly 60%. Passengers at BWI Marshall Airport were down 95%, and transit ridership was down nearly 80%. Since then, we have seen improvements in those numbers. Traffic on the roadways has pretty much returned to pre-pandemic levels, and track traffic is actually up about 15%. At BWI Marshall Airport, we're still in recovery mode with passengers down about 25% from pre-pandemic levels. And we're seeing a nationwide that airline industry has taken a little longer to recover than the roadway traffic. We're also seeing a much slower recovery in the transit system. Overall ridership is down about 40%, but there's a significant variation among the various transit modes. Core bus, for example, that service continues to provide essential transportation throughout the pandemic and did not see as significant ridership declines as some of the other modes. Core bus has steadily been increasing, and it's down about 30%. Our commuter services were impacted much more heavily. For example, ridership on the MARC and commuter bus continue to be down about 75%, and Metro is down 70%. Light rail is doing slightly better, but ridership still remains down by about 60%. So ridership on MARC and commuter bus is heavily driven by the federal workforce, as you all know. MTA is closely monitoring the trends and has restored full service so that it will be there when riders return to work. But while we're making major investments in our existing transit systems, we really need to think about what the transit system of the future might look like. A good opportunity for that is through MTA's statewide transit plan. This plan is the first of its kind and includes the entire state and sets a comprehensive vision for transit over the next 50 years. The draft plan is available now on MTA's website, and I encourage you to review it and provide comments. MTA is also making the system faster and more reliable and more accessible. Also easier to use by advancing the initiatives in the Central Maryland Regional Transit Plan. 2 corridor feasibility studies are now underway and will be out for public comment later this year. Now, Steve mentioned IIJA, topic of the month. And of course, we can't talk about infrastructure these days without talking about the IIJA funds, also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Steve did a great job of covering all the different programs and pots of money the bill will provide, but I just want to highlight a couple of key points. While it's true that the IIJA provides billions of dollars for transportation in Maryland, it's critical to note that not all that money is new money. The IIJA includes a 5-year reauthorization of service transportation programs. Approximately $5 billion of this funding is highway and transit formula funding to continue the current funding levels through the fiscal year 2026. Now, I don't want anybody to get me wrong. This is really important to us, but it gives us certainty about the funding levels over the next several years. But that portion of the money is already accounted for in the CTP. The IIJA also provides additional funding that we have not yet programmed and are waiting for federal appropriations and guidance for. As a matter of fact, Mr. Chairman, I spoke to House Member Steny Hoyer last week and urged him to try and get the appropriations completed. Obviously, it's a priority of his, and so he said he would see what he could do on his end. But we need those appropriations as well as the rules of the road, if you will. So currently, they're under the continuing resolution. It expires February 18th. It's uncertain at this time if Congress will pass a new appropriations bill before that time or pass another continuing resolution. With those new appropriations funding levels have been maintained at current levels, we're estimating about 20% more federal formula transportation funding for Maryland over the next 5 years. Total highway funding is $4.6 billion, which $1 billion is new monies. The total transit funding that we expect is about $1.7 billion, and 300 million of those monies are new. And airport funding, we expect $158 million for airport improvement program funds, which is, again, new money. Also, we know there'll be a number of new grant programs, as Steve explained, that will be available and we'll be ready to respond to as they become available. We expect the US DOT to use these programs to place high emphasis on climate change, equity, and state of good repair. State of good repair and asset management continues to be a major focus of Mdot. We utilize data-driven analytics to make informed decisions about where to invest our dollars. The 6-year capital program that we released last month totals $17.7 billion, our largest capital program ever. And I just want to stress that is before IIJA funds were available. The majority of the program is divided between transit and highways, with about 13% going to port, airport, and MVA, and some of the statewide efforts coordinated through the Secretary's office. Again, Steve did a great job of highlighting how CTP is funded, and I'll just add a couple notes. The CTP funding includes the $500 million in funding provided to Mdot as a result of the funding framework agreed to by the governor and legislature. So I want to thank you all for this investment in Maryland's transportation network. We've included in the CTP a list of all the projects that benefited from this additional funding, and the federal relief dollars, both the dollars that came through the state as well as those received directly by Mdot, were critical in sustaining the department's operations over the last 2 years. There's been a lot of focus on unprecedented fiscal situation that the state finds itself with billions of dollars in the bank, if you will, and a structural surplus for the foreseeable future. It's important to note that Mdot is in a very different position from the state right now. Steve's chart on page 5 of the DLS analysis showed that Mdot revenue forecast today is up $500 million from our forecast pre-pandemic, and will take you out when you take out the nearly $900 million of federal relief funds in this forecast, many of the Mdot revenue sources are still down considerably from where they were pre-pandemic levels. Our largest source of revenue is a motor fuel tax. It's still not fully recovered from the pandemic. I talked earlier about the slower recovery that we're seeing in the transit and airport passengers. Over the next 6 years, our forecast for operating revenues is down more than $500 million as a result. We talked about the IIJA monies, which will help offset that revenue loss, but a lot of those IIJA funds will also have requirements for state matching funds. That means we will have to continue to be very strategic about how we are investing our dollars. I mentioned the DLS analysis a couple of times already. I'd like to thank again our DLS analyst, Steve McCullough. Again, I'm going to steal him if I can, for identifying and discussing a couple of key issues the department's facing now. Steve did a great job of covering these issues, but I just want to spend time highlighting a few items. The DLS analysis included 2 recommended actions for Mdot. Both are pieces of the annual budget bill language that the department confers with. And with that, that will conclude my remarks. And I have a couple members of our team with us today. I, along with them, are more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Secretary Ports, just want to say thank you for that response. I did have a couple questions. I'm going to ask if they could be brief responses, and if necessary, me and you will tie back together for the response. I'm looking at a document put out by the Federal Highway Administration. It's the memorandum preliminary guidance in reference to the bill, Bipartisan Infrastructure law for the Build a Better America. It's put out by Deputy Administrator Stephanie Pollock. I've gotten a number of questions in reference to how local jurisdictions are going to be engaged. I know that you have put out, I know that you have talked about the CTP and that is what it is inclusive of, but I wanted to read you a part of it, just hear your comment in reference to how you'll engage local jurisdictions in reference to the IIJ money coming. So in that document on page 2, it states, resources made available under the bill and should be applied to modernize all eligible streets, highways, and bridges, not just those owned and operated by state departments of transportation. I would assume that that is talking about opportunities for our local jurisdictions. So if you can speak to how you're going to engage our local jurisdictions on the money that's coming from the feds, but the state will ultimately have that discretion.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm not surprised that you're well informed, Mr. Chairman, but as that, matter of fact, I talked to Stephanie Pollock last week also, by the way. So we've gotten together a good relationship, and some of what she is talking about, or what that page you referenced talks about, is, for example, there's a bridge program, and in that bridge program, we're supposed to redo some of our fair and poor bridges. Now there's a specific formula for how many are poor and how many are fair, and it also includes the fact that it's not, as you mentioned, not just state funds, not just state bridges, not just state bridges, but also local bridges. So what we are tasking the SHA with doing is getting with the local governments, finding out what their analysis is on those bridges, whether they're fair or poor, because again, there's a certain amount of funds that go to poor, there's a certain amount of funds that go to fair, so it has to comply with the federal guidelines. And from that, what will it take to get the poor bridges to fair or above? Because there's not enough money to replace all the bridges, but there may be monies in there to say resurface to get it from poor to fair, for example. So we need that analysis from the local government. So we're working on that already in preparation for those monies. Now, the total IIJA monies, I mentioned the $1 billion new money for highways, $300 million for transit, and $158 million for airports. So we will look at the CTP to see what has local impact, regional impact, and statewide impact to see, and quite frankly, what is, I hate to keep using the term shovel ready, to see what we can move on, because the federal government's also, we anticipate, is also going to say, you have this much money to spend in 23, this much money in 24, this much money in 25. So we have to make sure that we appropriate it according to what the rules they give us. And we will work with the local governments on that. And then, of course, there's discretionary grants. Steve McCullough talked about them. He called them discretionary, but he also called them competitive grants. And those are areas where the local government can put in for those grants specifically to fulfill their needs. And we will work with the local government like we always have on those grant applications and what it may take to try and get those funds. So all three of those different ways are ways that we're going to work with the local governments.
Thank you. I appreciate that. To the next question, in that same document is bolded, encouraging and prioritizing projects to build a better America. There's a part in there that says projects to be prioritized, including those that maximize existing right-of-ways for accommodations of non-motorized modes and transit options. Just want to make sure that as I look at this guidance, if I can hear how you envision modes, not just from transit, but also walking and biking, which is inclusive of that piece of it.
Sure, great question. So as you know, we have the Highway Safety Committee that's headed up by Administrator Nizer at the MVA. And we work very closely in that committee with the state police, the federal government, both in FHWA and NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And through that program, we identify areas of need for pedestrian and bicycle safety. And so we have a lot of that information and data on where we should start putting those funds. with regard to safety. Obviously, we want to attack those areas that have a high frequency of fatalities and or injuries for bicyclists and pedestrians. And we also want to work on behavior issues because, you know, we could do a lot with the infrastructure, but we also have to make people aware of the behavioral issues. Simple examples, you don't want to wear black clothing, dark clothing at night and try to cross the street, right? And you want to cross at the crosswalks. We want to make the crosswalk safe. And so all these different programs that help aid that situation. And I would also say that, you know, one of the initiatives we look at when you talk about walking, a lot of that helps the MTA with bus service. So if they can walk easier to the bus, then we can have more people, we can provide better services for that purpose in a safe manner. So we are looking at programs like that. And, you know, we have a pretty good bike trail ways in our CTP that we put money into. So we're looking at all these advantages that we can do.
Yep, I got two more questions. I'm gonna try my best to also be timely. 2021 June, Governor Hogan directs your predecessor, Secretary Slater, in reference to the negotiations of the B&P tunnel, the Frederick Douglass tunnel. Just want to be able to understand how are those negotiations transpiring thus far, and how far are we?
So I think I could give you a better review at the MTA budget hearing.
Okay.
I do know that we're negotiating with our partners on the railways. I believe at this moment we're looking at about $500 million of state funding to go toward that project. I believe it's a $4 billion project overall. And of course, with our contribution, if you will, we're also going to be looking for more passenger service to be available to us in Maryland. So that's brief.
And I'll follow.
I can give you a better.
Yeah, MTA.
We could follow up later, and I'll give you a fully blown description of that.
Yeah. Last question is in reference to what we call in Baltimore the highway to nowhere. Maryland's federal delegation. You got Chris Van Hollen, Kwesi Mfume, with the support of Mayor Scott, led the effort to the Reconnecting Communities Act, which is within a portion of bill. It commits $1 billion of dedicated funding to repair for damaged communities. And we look at the highway to nowhere as a perfect example of that space. If you could speak about how Mdot, I guess, will work with the city of Baltimore in reference to the challenges that happen in West Baltimore around the highway to nowhere, and how do you envision that? And that will be my final question.
Yeah, well, on that one, Mr. Chairman, can you guys hear me? It says my internet's unstable. Okay. On that one, I may have to get back to you for sure. I know that actually started with Barbara Mikulski stopping that way back when I was a kid, I think, and that's a long time ago. And let me get back to you on that one, because I want to make sure that first of all the money's appropriated.
Yeah.
I am not sure if it has been or not. I know that, you know, obviously they pass bills and there's a lot of things that they do,
Gotcha.
but until they appropriate it, it kind of doesn't count. Same with the IIJA money. But let me get back to you on that one, if you don't mind.
Yes, sir. I'm going to move to questions from my colleagues. I saw Senator Saling's hand. Senator Saling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Sports and Secretary, that is, for the information. And I want to thank Steve too. Just a question about the federal funds and how they're appropriated in some ways. We've talked briefly, and I've had some of the highway locals in my area come out and see some of our state highways and how, like, for instance, the lighting in some of our areas, how bad that is. And in some of our areas, how we don't have any sidewalks. And they're close by maybe some county roads, but they go right into some of the other areas where they're very busy areas, and some, I guess, some business, but they always talk about some sidewalks in some of the areas of importance. Is there ways that we can work with the monies coming in to the state and seeing how we could get some funds for that? Thank you.
So I'm going to go back to, firstly, it had to be appropriated, and secondly, we need to know what the rules are. Our hope is that they don't create a whole lot of new rules because we kind of have our priorities in order. At least we know what they are from the local level and the regional level and the state level. But if they throw a whole bunch of criteria in, then we may have to redo or reshift our funds. And until we get those rules, it's going to be a difficult question to answer. But you know that we do look at, like I just answered the chairman's question earlier, with our sidewalk, pedestrian, and bicycle safety. So we are looking at those issues. I just need to find out what the rules are before I can answer the question.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And again, we had in one of our areas, we had a very bad and serious accident that they were able to put one of the an overhead light in the, off of one of our main highways, state highway. But we also looked in a couple areas how bad. In some of the areas, we had no lighting whatsoever. So I think it's something of importance. So maybe we can talk about that later offline, but maybe it's something we could do also to work and get something done. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Senator.
Senator Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, congratulations, Mr. Secretary. Look forward to working with you. A couple of these, you can just send me the answers so we don't take up much time here. I know because we've talked that you'll continue to work with Pennsylvania, Secretary Slater did, and his people. Our big project at 219, because a fair amount of federal money, we can probably complete it on our side. And hopefully Pennsylvania, they've shown a lot of progress on their side. So it's looking a lot better on Pennsylvania side, at least what we're hearing out there. So if you can kind of keep me up to date on that. The study of the 270 corridor, does that include anything at Frederick where you got the merger?
Probably best to answer for the stuff tomorrow too.
Pretty bad. I mean, you get on a Friday night, it's really getting plugged up there, and I'm sure it's going to get worse. Is that any part of that study? How do you get, because what you get is you get people.
Oh, I got what you sent me, but
70 trying to cross over to get to 15. And that's what plugs it up.
Senator, could I just, okay.
no,
Senator McCray,
testimony.
Senator McCray, you're not on mute. So when Senator Edwards is answering a question, I'm hearing your conversation. I can't hear the question. So George, you were breaking up on me. Oh, George,
Yeah.
listen to me calling him George.
That's who I am. I'm
Senator
George.
Edwards, we worked together for a long time, right?
We did. We did. You can get back to me, but the 270 corridor study, is it look anything at Frederick where it gets plugged up with 70 coming in there? Because each year it gets worse. And the problem is these people coming up 270 want to get over on the 15 and they got to crawl across 70.
Yeah, we are looking at, right?
15. If it's not, I would hope you would include something there because that's going to have to be done at some point. Doesn't need to be done right now, but hopefully something you would look at. If you could just bring me up to date on that. And if you could,
Sure.
Cumberland's got 3 bridges that go over to CSX lines that the train ran into and plugged them all up. Actually kind of destroyed some. Are you working with the city of Cumberland? Is there any possibility of getting federal or state money to help fix? I think they got it for the Fayette Street one. Because they really need upgrades, cutting part of the town off from the other part of the town. So just bring that up. You can get back to me on that too. And thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Secretary Ports, that looked like that's all of the questions. So just want to say this opportunity again, I knew that this will not be your last time before this respective committee and look forward to further discussion. At this moment, I'd like to bring up Caleb Weiss, our budget analyst for Office of Administrative Hearing, to give us the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with the document. Can everyone see the document on the screen? Okay, to start the presentation for the Office of Administrative Hearings, I have the operating budget summary here. The fiscal 2023 allowance increases the budget by $225,000 or 1.4%, which brings the total to $16.8 million. Moving ahead, before I get to the current year's allowance, there is a fiscal 2022 deficiency appropriation. OAH billed the Department of Housing and Community Development for mortgage foreclosure mediations that took place during fiscal 2019. However, due to the COVID foreclosure moratorium and other COVID-related expenses, DHCD was not able to make these payments to OAH. And therefore, in order to close the budget, OAH canceled 2 outstanding encumbrances of these funds. This proposed 2022 deficiency appropriation provides the funds to cover the prior year expenses. Moving ahead to the fiscal 2023 allowance, as you can see here, 84% of the budget goes towards personnel expenditures. This is similar to prior years as well. The next 2 largest categories are rent at 6% and office computers and other expenses at 6% as well. For the proposed budget, as you can see here, there's funding in the budget to restore 2 priorly abolished positions within OAH, 1 office clerk position and 1 administrative law judge position. The funds have been restored in the fiscal 2023 budget. However, the positions themselves will be restored in a future supplemental budget. For non-personnel expenses, I'd like to highlight the funding for the e-filing system. This new information technology project will bring the filing system for OAH in line with other judicial agencies within the state, which have gone to an e-filing system. Here for the personnel data, there are no changes in the actual number of positions as of right now. However, as I did note prior, there is the funding for the 2 abolished positions in this budget, and the positions themselves will be restored in a supplemental budget. Moving on to the Managing for Results section in Exhibit 3. Here we have hearings by agency type and or type. As you can see, the largest 2 categories are the Maryland Department of Health here in the yellow at 44% and the Motor Vehicle Administration here in the red at 39%. The Department of Human Services is the 3rd largest at 9%, and then the others here. In Exhibit 4, we have another depiction of the total cases by agency, and this shows the case trends going back to 2013. As you can see, in the Motor Vehicle Administration, there's been a substantial decrease in cases since 2013. However, many of the other agencies, it's remained relatively stable over the time period, although you do see slight decreases in 2020 and 2021 in DHS, foreclosures, and other. Here we have the case processing times, and we asked that OAH should comment on the accessibility of virtual hearings, which have been implemented due to COVID-19, and the actions that are being taken to ensure that all Marylanders have access to these hearings. Here in the case processing times, you can see that in fiscal 2021, the processing times for basically all of the types of hearings, with the exception of the Department of Health ones, have increased fairly dramatically. Of particular note is the Department of Human Services one here in the red, and the foreclosure mediations here in the light blue. Moving ahead to Exhibit 6, we asked that OAH should comment on the decline across all 3 measures in fiscal 2021 and the actions that are being taken to address these declining satisfaction rates. That refers here to the satisfaction rates on 3 measures. The first is preparation or organization of the hearing process. The second in the purple is the fairness of the hearing. And the one here in the blue is the outcome of the hearing itself. As you can see in fiscal 2021, all 3 of these measures are down over the prior year. And with that, we have the recommended action. DLS recommends concurring with the governor's allowance. That's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Weitz, for such a detailed report. Seeing no further questions, I would like to bring up Judge Pock from the Office of Administrative Hearings. And Judge Pock, I just want to say it's always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
First, I'm going to make an opening statement, and then I'm going to make our management staff available for the questions. Good afternoon. I am Chief Administrative Law Judge Chung Park of the Office of Administrative Hearings. This is my first budget hearing, and it has been an honor to serve as a state of Maryland's third Chief Administrative Law Judge since July 1, 2020. Also with me today are OAH's Director of Finance and Administration, Denetta Harbell, and Directors and Deputy Directors of Operation, John Radick and Trish Delp, and Director and Deputy Director of Quality Assurance, Harriet Helfen and Latonia Dargan, and IT Director, Tag Ibrahim. It is a pleasure to meet you, Chairman McCray and Senator Edwards, Jackson, and Selling. I would like to thank OAH's new legislative analyst, Kelly Wise, for his thorough analysis. Kelly came to our Hunt Valley headquarters in the summer to receive an overview of our agency and meet members of OAH's management staff. I appreciate the time that he took to learn about our agency and important work that we do. OAH's entire workforce has been extremely agile and forward-thinking in past 2 years during this period of disruption and uncertainty. And I am proud to report that there is no backlog of cases waiting hearing because of OAH's ability to pivot to remote hearings. OAH remains vigilant of its statutorily defined role to provide flexible due process to the citizens of Maryland and has worked tirelessly to provide fair and impartial hearing to the people of Maryland who are affected by the actions of many state agencies in a safe, efficient, and timely manner. Accessibility and efficiency of OAH will remain strong as it continues to ensure diligent due process for all Marylanders. OAH will continue to embrace and improve technology and appreciates the funding for the much-needed e-filing system so that it can further enhance its efficiency and accessibility to the public. Thus, OAH concurs with the governor's allowance. I believe you all have OAH's pre-filed testimony. I and members of my management team are here and happy to answer any questions committee members might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Park. And let me say that if you would not have told us, we would have thought you were a regular before our respective hearings. Seeing no questions from any of my colleagues, that quickly ends the hearings for Office of Administrative Hearings. And colleagues, that look like that's the last agency that we have for the day. So that ends the hearings for Public Safety and Environment. Analyst Weiss, just want to say thank you again. Judge Park, the entire team, just want to say thank you all for your leadership, and everyone have a blessed day.
Thank you.